Kin's crimson glow painted the twisted wreckage in hellish shadows as another gust of Arctic wind slammed into the downed transport. Thalira's breath crystallized in the air, each exhale a reminder that her homeworld's tropical warmth was now light years away. Her environmental suit's heating elements had failed 3 hours ago, and the bone-deep cold was making her movements sluggish. The crash had been sudden and violent. One moment, they'd been conducting a routine atmospheric survey of Frostmere Station's abandoned research facility. The next, their transport was tumbling through a blizzard that had appeared from nowhere. The pilot hadn't even had time to send a distress signal before the winds caught them and slammed the ship into the station's landing field. Thalira had regained consciousness to find herself half buried in debris, her suit's systems flickering between amber warnings and critical failures. The transport's main hull had cracked like an egg, spilling cargo and equipment across 50 meters of frozen ground. The pilot was dead, his neck broken in the initial impact. She and Benton were the only survivors. She pressed her back against a chunk of hull plating, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. The human, Benton, had vanished into the storm 20 minutes ago, muttering something about finding shelter materials. Probably dead by now, she thought with growing despair. No species could survive in these conditions without proper equipment. The research station's buildings loomed in the distance like frozen tombstones, their dark windows staring blindly across the landing field. According to the mission briefing, Frostmere had been abandoned for over 2 years after a series of equipment failures made the facility too expensive to maintain. The irony wasn't lost on her that they'd crashed at a place specifically chosen for its inhospitable conditions. The wind howled across Frostmere Station's landing field, carrying with it the promise of death. According to her failing suit sensors, the temperature had dropped to minus 47 degrees, with winds gusting over 90 kilometers per hour. Even the station's emergency beacon was fighting a losing battle against the elements, its signal growing weaker by the hour. A metallic scraping sound cut through the storm's roar. Thalira forced her stiffening joints to move, peering around the debris. Through the swirling snow, she saw an impossible sight. Benton was dragging a section of hull plating across the ice, his breath visible but his movements steady and purposeful. He wasn't wearing his environmental suit. The human had stripped down to his basic work coveralls and was somehow functioning in temperatures that should have killed him within minutes. His exposed skin showed a reddish flush from the cold, but he moved with the casual efficiency of someone working in a mild climate. Even more disturbing, he seemed to be enjoying himself. As she watched in fascination and horror, Benton stopped to examine a piece of debris, brushing snow away with his bare hands to read some kind of technical marking. He nodded to himself with apparent satisfaction, then continued his methodical salvage operation. The way he moved suggested he was following some kind of systematic plan, rather than desperately scrounging for survival materials. Thalira tried to call out to him, but her voice was lost in the wind. Her suit's communication system had failed along with the heating elements, leaving her isolated in a bubble of steadily cooling air. She could only watch as the human continued his impossible work in conditions that represented her species' definition of instant death. Benton spotted her watching and changed direction, hauling his improvised sled toward her position. As he drew closer, she could see that his makeshift load included hull fragments, insulation panels, and what looked like components from the transport's heating system. He dropped the metal sheet beside her with a clang that rang across the empty landing field. "Found us some building materials. The fuel cells from the cargo bay are still intact." Thalira stared at him in bewilderment. The storm was intensifying, and the human was acting as if they were having a routine conversation. "You're not wearing your suit." Benton glanced down at his coveralls and shrugged, thing was making too much noise. Hard to hear what I was doing. He began sorting through the salvaged materials with practiced movements. Plus, it was getting in the way when I had to crawl into tight spaces. The casual dismissal of what should have been lethal exposure sent a chill through Thalira that had nothing to do with the temperature. Her species had evolved on a world where the coldest regions rarely dropped below 15 degrees. This frozen wasteland was beyond her comprehension, yet the human was treating it like a minor inconvenience. Benton started assembling the hull fragments into a rough linta structure against the largest piece of wreckage. His hands moved with surprising dexterity despite the cold, fitting pieces together, and using debris to anchor them against the wind. "We need to get you out of this wind," he said, not looking up from his work. "Your suit's heating system is shot, and hypothermia is going to be a problem soon." Thalira tried to respond, but her jaw muscles had stiffened to the point where speech was difficult. The human noticed her condition and picked up his pace, quickly completing a basic framework. He disappeared back into the storm, returning minutes later with an armload of insulation panels and what appeared to be emergency blankets from the transport's survival supplies. Working with methodical efficiency, he began sealing the gaps in their improvised shelter. The structure took shape around them, blocking the worst of the wind. Benton crawled inside and began arranging the fuel cells he'd salvaged. Within moments, he had them connected in series and generating heat through jury-rigged resistor coils. The temperature in their tiny refuge began to climb. Thalira felt sensation returning to her extremities as the warmth penetrated her failing suit. Benton sat back on his heels, watching her with the patient attention of someone assessing a technical problem rather than a dying colleague. "Better?" he asked. Thalira managed a stiff nod. Her throat felt raw from breathing the frigid air, but she could finally speak coherently. "How are you not dead?" The temperature outside would freeze cellular fluid in minutes. Benton settled against the far wall of their shelter, seemingly unbothered by the question. "Grew up in northern Canada. Spent winters working oil rigs in the Arctic. This is maybe a bit colder, but not by much." The casual comparison stunned her. A bit colder. He was treating a Class 3 deathworld's killing cold as if it were merely uncomfortable weather. She tried to wrap her mind around the implications. Your homeworld has regions this cold. Parts of it gets down to -60 some winters. The human stretched his legs out, apparently relaxing despite their dire circumstances. "Course, we usually have better gear when we're working in it, but you learn to function without it if you have to." He spoke with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing routine occupational hazards. Thalira realized that what she was experiencing as a fight for survival, he was treating as an inconvenient work assignment. The gulf between their species' environmental tolerances was becoming clear, and it was far wider than she'd ever imagined. What kind of work requires functioning in such conditions? She managed to ask, her voice still rough from the cold air. Benton considered the question thoughtfully. Oil and gas extraction mostly, mining operations, search and rescue when people get lost in blizzards. My grandfather worked construction in Siberia back on Earth. Used to tell stories about pouring concrete in 40 below weather. The casual mention of multiple industries that required routine exposure to killing cold sent another chill through Thalira. An entire economy built around working in conditions that would exterminate most galactic species within minutes. No wonder humans had spread across so many hostile worlds since joining the galactic community. Emergency services, too, Benton continued. Fire departments, ambulance crews, police. Can't exactly tell people to wait for nice weather when they need help. You develop techniques for staying functional when the environment's trying to kill you. Emergency services operating in deathworld conditions. The concept was so alien to her experience that she struggled to process it. Her homeworld's emergency responders dealt with minor injuries and the occasional severe storm. The idea of rescue workers routinely functioning in lethal environments was beyond her comprehension. Thalira stared at him as the full scope of human environmental tolerance became clear. No wonder the galaxy classified Earth as a deathworld. Any species that could casually survive in conditions that would kill most civilized life forms was, by definition, a terrifying aberration. The fuel cells hummed quietly, their warmth gradually restoring feeling to her hands and feet. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the station, but their shelter held firm against the wind. Benton had somehow created a livable space from wreckage and spare parts, working with the calm competence of someone solving a routine problem. "How long until rescue?" he asked. Thalira checked her suit's communication system, noting the weak signal strength. 3 days minimum. The storm's interfering with long-range communications, and they'll wait for it to pass before launching a recovery mission. Benton nodded as if she'd given him a weather report rather than a potential death sentence. "We'll need more fuel for the heating system." The cargo bay had some emergency supplies, but most of it scattered across the landing field. He started to rise, clearly intending to venture back into the killing cold. Thalira grabbed his arm with a strength born of desperation. "You can't keep going out there. The storm's getting worse, and even humans have limits." Benton paused, studying her face in the dim light of the fuel cell heaters. His expression was thoughtful rather than annoyed by her concern. "Yeah, you're right about the storm, but we need water, food, and more heat sources if we're going to last 3 days." He settled back down, apparently willing to wait for the immediate weather to pass. The pragmatic acceptance of their situation was somehow more unsettling than panic would have been. Most species would be in various stages of hysteria by now, but the human was already planning for extended survival. "Tell me about your world," Thalira said, partly from curiosity and partly to keep her mind off their circumstances. "What's it like living on a death world?" Benton considered the question with the same methodical approach he'd shown while building their shelter. "Most of it's pretty nice, actually. Where I grew up, summers get up around 30 degrees, lots of lakes and forests. Good fishing." The description sounded almost pleasant until Thalira realized he was using the same temperature scale that made their current environment lethal. 30 degrees would be a comfortable day on her homeworld. The casual mention of temperatures that spanned nearly a 100-degree range spoke to an adaptability that defied everything she thought she knew about biological limitations. "Winter's the challenging season," Benton continued. "Roads ice over, power goes out when ice storms hit the lines. Have to know how to heat your house without electricity, how to find food when the stores are closed." He spoke of survival skills as basic life knowledge, the way someone might discuss cooking or cleaning. The implications sent another chill through Thalira that had nothing to do with the cold. An entire species raised from childhood to survive in conditions that would kill most galactic citizens. "What about predators?" she asked. Benton's expression grew more animated. "Bears, mostly. Cougars in some areas. Wolves if you get far enough north. Nothing that won't leave you alone if you know what you're doing." The casual dismissal of what sounded like apex predators reinforced the growing picture of Earth as a world where every day was a survival challenge. Her own homeworld had small herbivores and the occasional mildly aggressive insect. The idea of sharing territory with large carnivores was beyond her experience. "How large are these bears?" she asked, morbid curiosity overcoming her discomfort. "Polar bears can get up to 800 kilograms. Grizzlies may be half that." Benton spoke as if discussing the size of common livestock. "Black bears are smaller, but they're the ones you see most often near populated areas." 800 kilograms of predator sharing the same environment where humans routinely worked and lived. Thalira tried to imagine encountering such a creature and found herself shuddering despite the slowly warming air in their shelter. "You mentioned wolves," she pressed. "Pack hunters. Smart, coordinated. They'll take down prey much larger than individual pack members. But again, they generally avoid humans unless they're starving or defending territory." Benton paused thoughtfully. "Actually had a wolf pack den near one of the drilling sites I worked. Crew took to leaving scraps for them, made sure we didn't interfere with their hunting grounds. They left us alone, we left them alone." The idea of casually coexisting with pack-hunting predators while conducting industrial operations struck Thalira as the height of madness. Yet Benton spoke of it as routine workplace management, another factor to consider along with weather and equipment maintenance. "What about the ocean predators?" she asked, remembering fragments from Earth's planetary survey data. "Sharks, mostly, some pretty impressive specimens." Benton smiled slightly, as if recalling pleasant memories. "Great whites, tiger sharks, bull sharks. Had a summer job on a fishing boat off the coast of South Africa. Saw a great white that must have been 6 meters long. 6 meters of oceanic predator, and the human was smiling about it." Thalira began to understand why galactic insurance companies charged premium rates for policies covering human-inhabited worlds. The storm's intensity seemed to be diminishing, the wind's howl dropping to a steady moan rather than the earlier shriek. Benton noticed the change and began preparing for another supply run. "Stay put and keep warm," he said, checking the fuel cell connections. "I'll be back in an hour with everything we need." Before Thalira could protest, he was gone, vanishing into the swirling snow with the confident stride of someone going to run a routine errand. She huddled in the shelter he'd built, surrounded by the evidence of his casual competence in conditions that represented her species' definition of hell. The fuel cells continued their quiet operation, maintaining a pocket of warmth in the frozen wasteland. Outside, she could hear the human moving through the wreckage, his progress marked by the occasional clang of metal or scrape of debris. The sounds were methodical and purposeful, suggesting he was working through a systematic salvage plan rather than desperately scrounging for supplies. At one point, she heard what sounded like metal being cut or shaped, followed by a series of rhythmic impacts, then silence for several minutes, broken only by the wind. When the sounds resumed, they came from a different direction entirely, suggesting Benton had moved his operation to another part of the crash site. The systematic nature of his work was almost more unsettling than his environmental tolerance. This wasn't desperate survival behavior. This was professional competence applied to extreme circumstances, as if building emergency shelters in killing cold was just another day at the office. An hour and 15 minutes later, she heard the scraping sound of his improvised sled returning. Through the shelter's entrance, she could see him approaching through the snow, moving with the same unhurried efficiency he'd displayed throughout their ordeal. True to his word, Benton returned within the hour, dragging another improvised sled loaded with equipment. This time his haul included water containers, emergency rations, additional fuel cells, and several items she didn't immediately recognize. He'd also somehow acquired a collection of tools and what appeared to be salvaged components from the research station itself. He efficiently upgraded their shelter, adding insulation and expanding the heated area. The new fuel cells provided redundant heating systems, ensuring they wouldn't freeze if one unit failed. The unknown items turned out to be components for a more sophisticated water reclamation system designed to stretch their liquid supplies. He'd even managed to salvage part of the transport's communication array, though it would need significant repair work to function. "Found the station's emergency cache," he explained while connecting the new equipment. standard cold weather supplies, enough food and water for 5 people for a week. The communication gear was locked in a maintenance building, but the door mechanism had frozen solid, easy enough to bypass. Thalira watched him work, beginning to understand that bypassing frozen security systems was apparently within the normal skill set of humans who worked in cold environments. The station's emergency supplies, designed for use by trained personnel with proper equipment, had been accessible to Benton despite the harsh conditions and his lack of specialized tools. As he continued the upgrade process, she noticed that he'd made other improvements as well. The shelter now had multiple chambers, including a separate area for equipment storage and what appeared to be a workshop space. He'd even created a crude but functional airlock system to minimize heat loss when entering and leaving. The tools he'd acquired turned out to be a mix of salvaged items from the transport and equipment borrowed from the station's maintenance facilities. With these, he began constructing what could only be described as creature comforts: a more efficient ventilation system, improved sleeping areas, even a primitive but functional sanitation facility. Also rigged a backup power system, he mentioned casually while testing the communication array. Found some solar panels on the station's roof that were still functional. Won't generate much power in this weather, but every bit helps. Solar panels, in a blizzard, on a Class 3 deathworld. The human had somehow identified, accessed, and salvaged functioning equipment from an abandoned facility in conditions that should have made such work impossible, and he spoke of it as routine maintenance activity. The human had not only survived a prolonged exposure to killing cold, but had successfully conducted a complex salvage operation in conditions that would have incapacitated most species within minutes. Thalira watched him work, beginning to understand why Earth was classified as a Class 12 deathworld, and its inhabitants treated with a mixture of respect and wariness by galactic authorities. The first night in their improvised shelter proved comfortable beyond Thalira's expectations. The heating system maintained a steady temperature well above freezing, and the insulation Benton had installed kept the wind from penetrating their living space. She'd actually slept soundly for the first time since the crash, her body finally able to stop fighting the cold and begin recovering from the trauma. She woke to find Benton already up and working on something near the shelter's entrance. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline landscape under pale morning light. Through the transparent panel he'd somehow installed as a window, she could see the full extent of the research station for the first time. The facility was larger than she'd realized, with multiple buildings connected by enclosed walkways. Several structures showed obvious signs of abandonment, with broken windows and damaged roofing, but others appeared to be in better condition. Most importantly, she could see that at least one building still had its lights on, suggesting some systems remained functional. "Morning," Benton said without looking up from his work. "Weather cleared up nice. Should be able to get the communication array working today." He was assembling what appeared to be a more sophisticated version of the equipment he'd salvaged the day before. Components from their transport had been combined with station hardware to create something that looked almost professional in its complexity. "How do you know how to build all this?" Thalira asked, gesturing at the array of improvised but effective systems surrounding them. Benton paused in his work to consider the question. "Mostly you learn by doing. Spent a lot of time working in places where the nearest repair shop was 1,000 kilometers away. You either figure out how to fix things yourself, or you don't work." The casual explanation revealed another aspect of human culture that Thalira was beginning to appreciate. Self-reliance wasn't just a survival trait for them. It was a fundamental requirement for functioning in their environment. The alternative was death, so competence became a basic life skill. After a breakfast of emergency rations that Benton had somehow made palatable through creative preparation, he began gathering equipment for his expedition to the station. Tools, portable heating elements, salvaged communication components, and what appeared to be improvised safety gear went into a pack that he'd constructed from salvaged materials. "Keep the fuel cells running while I'm gone," he instructed, checking the heating system one final time. "If anything starts acting up, there's a manual override on the main power distribution panel. Red button shuts everything down safely." The casual way he delegated critical system management to her was both reassuring and terrifying. Reassuring because it showed he trusted her competence. Terrifying because it demonstrated how routine this level of technical responsibility was for him. Benton set off across the frozen landscape with the ground-eating stride of someone accustomed to covering distance in harsh conditions. Thalira watched through their improvised window as he approached the station's buildings, noting how he moved with constant awareness of his surroundings, while still maintaining efficient progress toward his objective. The first building he examined appeared to be some kind of storage facility. She could see him checking the structure's exterior, testing door mechanisms, and apparently assessing the building's overall condition before attempting entry. When he did gain access, he disappeared inside for nearly an hour. When he emerged, he was carrying additional equipment and what looked like building materials. Rather than returning immediately to their shelter, he continued to the next structure in the complex. His systematic approach to the exploration suggested he was following some kind of professional protocol for investigating abandoned facilities. The second building proved more challenging. She could see him working on the entrance for an extended period, using tools to address what appeared to be a frozen or damaged access system. When he finally gained entry, he was inside for over 2 hours. During his absence, Thalira found herself studying their shelter with new appreciation for human engineering capabilities. Every system Benton had installed was both elegantly simple and surprisingly robust. The heating system had multiple redundancies. The ventilation provided fresh air without wasting heat. Even the furniture he'd constructed from salvaged materials was comfortable and functional. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the mindset that had created these systems. This wasn't desperate improvisation. This was methodical problem-solving applied to extreme circumstances. Benton had approached their survival situation with the same systematic competence he probably brought to routine maintenance tasks. When he finally returned from the station, he was practically glowing with satisfaction. "The communications center's partially functional," he announced, unloading an impressive array of salvaged equipment. "Main transmitters damaged, but the backup systems are solid. Should be able to get a signal out to the orbital relay network." He began unpacking components that looked far more sophisticated than anything they'd had access to previously. Power amplifiers, signal processors, antenna arrays, and what appeared to be a complete communication control system. Found something else interesting too, he continued while organizing the equipment. The station's geothermal plant is still functional. Been running on automatic for 2 years, maintaining minimal power to essential systems. If we can tap into that power grid, we'll have all the electricity we need. Geothermal power systems, communication networks, infrastructure management. The human was treating an abandoned research facility like a resource to be systematically exploited rather than a dangerous unknown to be avoided. By the time their rescue ship arrived 3 days later, Benton had converted their crash site into a fully functional survival camp. He'd established multiple heat sources, organized a water purification system, created comfortable sleeping areas, and even rigged a communication array that had successfully contacted the recovery team. The transformation was so complete that when the rescue ship's pilot first saw their camp, he initially mistook it for a permanent research installation. The systematic layout, professional-grade equipment setup, and obvious infrastructure development made it difficult to believe they were looking at an emergency shelter built from crashed debris. More impressive still was the integration with the abandoned station systems. Benton had somehow managed to connect their improvised camp to the facility's geothermal power grid, providing abundant electricity for heating, lighting, and equipment operation. He'd also established a communication link with the station's still functional computer systems, giving them access to weather data, facility schematics, and historical research records. The rescue crew found Thalira in good health despite her ordeal, warm and well-fed in a shelter that would have been adequate for a permanent Arctic research station. They found Benton teaching her basic cold weather survival techniques, apparently treating their deathworld experience as an educational opportunity. He'd spent the morning showing her how to read weather patterns from atmospheric pressure changes, how to identify the most efficient locations for extracting water from snow, and how to construct emergency heating systems from common materials. The lesson had the systematic thoroughness of professional instruction rather than casual conversation. What's really impressive, Thalira told the rescue team leader, is that he did all this while treating the whole experience as routine maintenance work. Never once acted like we were in any real danger. The team leader, a grizzled spacer who'd seen his share of emergency rescues, nodded knowingly. That's humans for you. What kills the rest of us is just Tuesday morning to them. As they loaded the salvaged equipment aboard the rescue ship, the crew chief approached Benton with obvious professional respect. That's some impressive work you did down there. How long have you been doing Arctic survival operations? Benton finished securing the last of their gear and shrugged with typical human understatement. Just something you pick up growing up where the weather tries to kill you 6 months out of every year. The crew chief nodded knowingly, though Thalira suspected he didn't truly comprehend the casual horror of that statement. She was beginning to understand that humans didn't consider their homeworld particularly dangerous because they'd been shaped by its challenges from birth. What other species saw as deathworld conditions, humans saw as character-building weather. The rescue ship's medical officer conducted standard post-crisis evaluations on both survivors. Thalira showed mild symptoms of environmental stress and minor hypothermic exposure, all well within normal parameters for her species. Benton's evaluation revealed no significant health impacts whatsoever. His blood pressure was normal, his core temperature was stable, and his stress indicators were actually lower than baseline. Textbook cold weather exposure response, the medical officer noted in his report. Subject adapted to extreme environmental conditions without apparent difficulty. Physiological resilience consistent with deathworld evolutionary patterns. What the medical report couldn't capture was Benton's obvious satisfaction with the work he'd accomplished. He'd taken a potentially fatal survival situation and turned it into an opportunity to demonstrate human engineering capabilities. The crashed transport had become raw materials for construction projects. The abandoned research station had become a resource to be systematically exploited. Even the hostile environment had become simply another variable to be managed. As they loaded the salvaged equipment aboard the rescue ship, the crew chief approached Benton with obvious professional respect. That's some impressive work you did down there. How long have you been doing Arctic survival operations? Benton finished securing the last of their gear and shrugged with typical human understatement. Just something you pick up growing up where the weather tries to kill you 6 months out of every year. The crew chief nodded knowingly, though Thalira suspected he didn't truly comprehend the casual horror of that statement. She was beginning to understand that humans didn't consider their homeworld particularly dangerous because they'd been shaped by its challenges from birth. What other species saw as deathworld conditions, humans saw as character-building weather. During the flight back to the orbital station, Thalira found herself studying her human colleague with new appreciation. Benton had saved her life with the same quiet competence he probably brought to routine atmospheric maintenance tasks. The galaxy's classification of humans as dangerous wasn't based on their aggression or technology, she realized. It was based on their ability to treat the impossible as merely inconvenient. As their transport docked with the research station, Thalira made a mental note to update her species' files on human environmental tolerance. The official records listed impressive temperature ranges and survival capabilities, but they failed to capture the most unsettling aspect of human nature. They didn't just survive in deathworld conditions, they thrived in them. Benton helped her gather her equipment as the airlock cycled open, treating her as a colleague rather than a liability he'd been forced to rescue. The casual equality of his manner drove home another uncomfortable truth about humans. They extended the same consideration to species that would be helpless in their environment that they expected from those species in different circumstances. The combination of environmental hardiness and social generosity created a species that was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Thalira suspected she'd spend considerable time in the coming weeks trying to process the implications of what she'd witnessed. The galaxy's apex predators, it seemed, were also its most reliable allies. As they walked toward the debriefing rooms, Benton mentioned that the experience had given him some ideas for improving the station's emergency protocols. His suggestions would undoubtedly save lives in future crises, derived from knowledge gained during what he'd probably file as a routine maintenance incident. Thalira realized she was looking forward to working with him on those improvements, despite everything she'd learned about human capabilities, or perhaps because of it. She found herself genuinely liking the unpretentious atmospheric technician who treated a Class 3 deathworld survival situation as an opportunity for professional development. The human approach to existence, she reflected, might be exactly what the galaxy needed more of. When the universe tried to kill you, the human response wasn't to curl up and die. It was to build something better from the wreckage and share the knowledge with anyone who might need it. As they entered the station proper, warm air washing over them from the environmental systems, Thalira couldn't help but smile. She'd survived her first real deathworld experience, and she'd learned that humans were far more than the sum of their intimidating capabilities. They were, in their own quietly competent way, the best possible companions for a hostile universe. The debriefing session that followed proved to be an education in itself. The station commander, a veteran administrator who'd overseen dozens of emergency rescues, listened to their account with growing amazement. When Benton mentioned his integration with the abandoned facility's power systems, the commander actually stopped taking notes to stare at him. You connected an improvised shelter system to a geothermal power grid using salvaged components. In sub-zero temperatures, without technical documentation, Benton shrugged with his characteristic modesty. The connection protocols were pretty standard, just had to trace the power distribution network and find a safe tap point. The commander exchanged glances with his technical staff, clearly struggling to process the casual nature of Benton's explanation. What he'd described represented advanced engineering work that would normally require specialized equipment and detailed facility schematics. After the official debriefing concluded, Thalira found herself walking through the station's observation deck with Benton, looking down at the planet where they'd crashed. Frostmir's ice-covered surface glittered under the system's distant sun, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. "Still looks cold down there," Benton observed with understated humor. Thalira laughed, surprising herself with how comfortable she felt discussing their ordeal. Cold enough to kill most of the known galaxy, but apparently not cold enough to slow down humans very much. They stood in companionable silence for several minutes, watching the planet slowly rotate beneath them. Thalira found herself thinking about the broader implications of what she'd witnessed. If humans could casually survive and thrive in conditions that represented certain death to most species, what did that mean for the galaxy's future? The answer, she realized, was both promising and slightly terrifying. Humans were natural pioneers, capable of establishing footholds in environments that would remain forever inaccessible to other species. But more importantly, they were natural teachers, sharing their hard-won knowledge with anyone willing to learn. Benton had spent their final day on Frostmere teaching her skills that could save her life in similar situations. He'd done it with the patient thoroughness of someone who genuinely wanted her to succeed, not because he expected anything in return, but because teaching others to survive was apparently a fundamental human instinct. "You know," she said finally, "I think I understand now why the Galactic Council has been so eager to establish partnerships with Earth." Benton turned to look at her with curiosity. "Oh, it's not just because you're tough enough to survive on deathworlds," she explained. "It's because you're generous enough to help the rest of us survive there too. That's a rare combination in the galaxy." Benton considered her words thoughtfully. "Makes sense, I guess. No point in learning how to survive alone if you can teach others to survive with you. More people around means better chance everyone makes it through whatever comes next." The simple philosophy behind his words encapsulated everything Thalira had learned about humans during their ordeal. They'd been shaped by harsh conditions that demanded both individual competence and collective cooperation. The result was a species that instinctively worked to improve survival odds for everyone, not just themselves. As they prepared to part ways and return to their respective duties, Thalira realized that her perspective on humanity had undergone a fundamental shift. 3 days ago, she'd thought of humans as dangerous deathworld predators to be treated with cautious respect. Now, she understood them as something far more complex and valuable. They were the galaxy's safety net, the species that could step in when the impossible became necessary. And they did it with a casual competence that made the extraordinary seem routine. In a universe full of dangers that could overwhelm any individual species, humans represented something precious. The promise that someone would always be capable of building solutions from the wreckage. "Thank you," she said simply, offering Benton the traditional farewell gesture of her species. He responded with a smile and the easy handshake humans used for the same purpose. "Just doing my job. Let me know if you need any help with those emergency protocol revisions." As he walked away, Thalira reflected on how perfectly that response captured the essence of human nature. Saving lives, solving impossible problems, and thriving in hostile environments wasn't heroic behavior to them. It was just doing their job. And in a galaxy full of species that needed that job done, humanity had found its perfect role. She looked out at Frostmere one last time, no longer seeing a frozen deathworld, but rather a test that humanity had passed with characteristic understated excellence. Tomorrow, she would begin writing her report on the incident, but she already knew what her conclusion would be. Humans weren't just survivors. They were builders, teachers, and the closest thing to a universal problem-solving resource the galaxy had ever seen. And the most remarkable thing about them was that they had no idea how remarkable they were.